Thanks very much, Phil, and thanks very much to everybody for coming. I very much appreciate it. Phil mentioned Keynes, and one of Keynes' famous quotes was that the difficulty lies not in accepting new ideas, but in escaping from old ones. And what I want to offer you today is what, for many of us, will be a new frame for thinking about government spending and the government budget. For some people, you might find your natural reaction to some of the things that I'm going to say will be a mix of disbelief and sometimes moral anger. Sometimes when I do teach these ideas in all three universities in South Australia, there's one or two people that have heard me explain them before here. Sometimes I get the reaction from people where they come up to me and they say something along the lines of, how can I say that to my son? I had a student say this to me a couple of years ago. What sort of message is it for me to give my son that the government can just spend without constraint? And my reaction to that generally is that it's just a fact. I explain that your budget, your son's budget, has nothing at all in common with the budget of the Australian Commonwealth Government or the government of any other country which has a similar financial system to ours. But if you have those sensations yourself, those feelings yourself, as you listen to me this evening, then don't feel bad about it, because that was exactly my reaction to this. I had just the same problems that you might find yourself having when it comes to escaping from ideas which have been inculcated in us for many, many years, and metaphors which we've become very, very used to, where we equate the government budget with a household budget, or maybe the budget of a business organisation, when they have nothing whatsoever in common. Now, I heard a very intelligent, very committed, and this person may even be here now because it's a South Australian progressive, it's not Mark, but a progressive politician being interviewed on news radio yesterday morning. Actually, what can you put over in a radio interview? They crucify you if you pursue these arguments, given that you have only a minute or two to react to whatever the interviewer has to say. But the interviewer said, word for word, I typed it out, almost as they were having a conversation. Do you accept the government can only spend what it earns? And the interviewee said, of course I accept the government can only spend what it earns. My reaction to that, and Phil's reaction to that, and the reaction of any modern monetary theorist to that, would, generally speaking, be to turn the radio off. And I'd be tempted to kick the cat almost, were it not for the fact that I love cats. And it's the wrong language. The government, the Commonwealth Government, doesn't earn anything. In a sense, it neither has nor doesn't have money, as we're going to discover. But it certainly doesn't earn anything. The government's taxes are not what the government earns. Neither is it the case that it is the role of taxation in a modern financial system to, in some sense, pay for government spending. That's one of the messages that I got for you this evening. It's the wrong language, it's the wrong metaphor. It buys into the neoliberal metaphor of the government as though it was a business that had to make a profit, or as though it was a household that had to earn money to pay for its spending now, or if it spends more than it earns now, needs to earn the money in future years to pay back its debt. Technically, actually, if the Australian government ever paid back all of its financial liabilities, we would have no financial system. There would be no money. I'm not even sure what it means for the government to pay back all of its debts. It's almost a meaningless thing to say. And you get all the wrong inferences from it. Even if you are a progressive politician, you're on the back foot already. You're using the language and the metaphors of the neoliberals, and you're kind of accepting the idea that governments on average over time have to balance their budgets. I'm going to show you in a few minutes that that's never been true. Nearly all governments, nearly all the time, throughout modern economic history have not balanced their budgets. The Australian Commonwealth government has nearly always run a budget deficit. In the case of the US, you could take the word nearly out, apart from a few years under Bill Clinton. They've always run a budget deficit. The same thing is true in the UK. The same thing is true in most countries, even hard-working countries like Germany, as I'm going to show you. Our government is a monetary sovereign. It's a currency-issuing central government, and moreover, we're not on a gold standard. We haven't been on a fixed exchange rate since 1983. We have no commitment to exchange our currency at a fixed rate for any real asset or anything which has a fixed value. And that gives our government a freedom of policy space which is not available, for example, to Eurozone governments, countries which have foolishly signed away their monetary sovereignty, signed away a lot of their policy space, as recent experience tells us. So here's the take-home message. This is what we're going to get to at the end, but I thought I'd say it at the beginning. Cuts certainly aren't necessary right now. Neither do we need a higher overall tax burden. There may be many reasons why you might think that some taxes ought to be higher than they are at the moment. There are good reasons why the mining companies ought to be paying more tax, for example. But the idea that it's necessary for the government to be able to pay for those public services we need, or those investments we need, is simply not true. It's fallacious. The government deficit, I'm going to show you, ought to be, almost certainly, significantly higher than it is right now. Even that term budget deficit is misleading. The word budget buys into the metaphor of the government as a household. And the word deficit, of course, deficit means a shortfall. Something's lacking. Surplus is naturally good, deficit is naturally bad. It would be better to talk about a government net injection into the economy than a budget deficit. But I'm so used to using the neoliberal language myself, I am going to be talking about government deficits and budget deficits with you this evening. A government budget deficit in no sense burdens future generations of Australians. The Australian government had something like 7 or 8 times as much debt at the end of the Second World War as it does now. Some of you, I guess, are perhaps more senior than me in years. Maybe you grew up during the 1950s, 60s, you're young adults in the 70s. Did you feel that you were under a terrible burden because of the enormous Australian government debt which existed in the 1940s and 50s? I don't think so. It's a myth. We can afford full employment if we can develop the institutions which are necessary to deliver it without inflation taking off. Our government, the Australian government, as long as it doesn't borrow in foreign currency, as long as we don't join a fixed exchange rate system, as long as we don't, and we probably have been foolish enough if they let us, join the Eurozone, can't ever go bust. This is not a theory, although it's often discussed under the heading modern monetary theory, which makes it sound really complicated. It's just a simple fact. The constraints on what the government can spend, the constraints on what we can all spend, are inflation, and also, of course, the total amount of goods and services which we consume without destroying our environment, which kind of depends on what types of goods and services we consume and how we choose to produce them. Money isn't something we're short of. Now, I just wanted to make the point that this is a massively exploding area of interest in macroeconomics. In recent years, there have been many, many academic papers published and many important books published by not just lefty academics like Phil, but very famous international academic Randall Wray's a very famous American economist. Warren Mosler is a multi-millionaire fund manager. He's hardly a lefty. His book's freely available online. I can give you a link to it. The guy over on the right-hand side has written more or less exactly what I'm going to say to you in the next few minutes. Frank Newman, he was Deputy Treasury Secretary in the US in the 1990s. These people are insiders. Warren Mosler was a central banking insider. Frank Newman was a Treasury insider. These are not kooky ideas, they're not even a theory really, it's just a set of facts. That's all I've got to share with you. These people are not deficit hawks. We've all heard deficit hawks, they generally speaking right for the Australian or on the right of the Liberal Party, and their ideas about government budgets are probably 100 years out. I'm not really going to worry about them. We're just going to dismiss their ideas out of hand. And most of the people that you hear from, well, Malcolm Turnbull leftwards really, are deficit doves. We only get the choice in this country normally. It's really frustrating between deficit hawks and deficit doves. And the deficit doves are the people who say, yes, the government, of course, the government on average has to balance its budget just like your household does. But households borrow money sometimes, businesses borrow money sometimes, they make a profit other times. These are the deficit doves. They're no more correct, and they're nicer on the whole. They're a bit more realistic and they do less damage, but they're no more correct than the deficit hawks are. Owls can see in the dark. A very prominent modern monetary theorist called Stephanie Kelton started using this term, deficit owl. There is nothing particularly good or bad about any particular level of Commonwealth government budget deficit, or perhaps even under some circumstances rarely surplus. You have to judge it in the context of the economy as a whole and the excess capacity we have to produce goods and services in the economy, the level of unemployment and underemployment and insecure employment. But the idea that the government needs to balance its budget over time, otherwise it will go bust, is a nonsense. It's always been nonsense, really. It's particularly nonsense in a country like Australia since 1983, from 1983 onwards. And indeed, the other message is that government budgets are not only normally in deficit. In Australia and in every country in the world this is true, except for a few oil-rich countries with relatively small populations. Some of the Gulf states. Norway is another example of countries which have on average run government budget surpluses. Everywhere else, the budget is nearly always in deficit. And this is a good thing for a variety of reasons. Now, the myth, where does it come from? This is a picture that a modern money theory guy who's actually originally an architect put together, and there's another slightly more complicated picture coming up. This is the myth. The idea that the private sector from somewhere has got a little bit of money, but not much, and the government's stealing all this money, stealing the private sector's money in taxes or borrowing the money. China's got loads of money. By the way, the Chinese government runs budget deficits nearly every year as well. China's supposed to have loads of money, and this is for the US federal government, the Commonwealth government. They're absorbing all this money, and they're wasting it all on entitlements, paying out all the money to lazy people.